focus ought to be, not the borders of Poland.
Thanks. Another question. You've ably covered a lot of the criticisms of Wilson and how unfair many of them are. Another one that's often made is that Wilson had sort of a naive view of human nature, and his system of the world depended on humans being better than they actually behave in practice, and states behave in practice. I wanted to ask, do you think that is a fair critique, that he had an unrealistic view of human nature, and that informed the 14 points and his other ideas?
Well, since I spent 20 minutes talking about how pragmatic he was, I guess I don't agree with that. As a completely holistic formulation of Woodrow Wilson, I think that he was a politician. He understood politics. I mean, he is not naive and doesn't, I mean, the only PhD ever to become president. I don't think you're a naive person in terms of forging that path. So I think he understood politics. But I do think that what he was trying to do was, again, to suggest that you don't have to make a choice between pursuing your self-interest and being, as president, responsible for the nation's national security, and also thinking about what could be. And reordering international relations to him was, yes, a kind of plan, a dream, a hope, but at the same time, were the alternatives better? To go back to a balance of power system, to end this war with these empires intact. How could you go to all of the people who had suffered and lost and hoped and tell them this is the outcome of the war? If you think people were disillusioned because of the Versailles Peace Treaty, imagine how people would have felt if that had been the outcome of the war. Now, Wilson, in a sense, I mean, there's, again, we always read the 14 points back from the Versailles Peace Treaty. But what people forget about the Versailles Peace Treaty is, yes, you had the League of Nations, but you also had Wilson on the side promising to have a bilateral defense alliance with France, which he never got through the Senate. But that shows that he's not just thinking. I mean, this was what he had to do in order to get the French to agree. So there was a sense, too, which would have also been a hard sell, because we didn't have those kind of alliances either. So that would have been as hard for America to join a balance of power system, would have been as hard a sell to America as the idea of joining a League of Nations. So then, in a sense, what we kind of in retrospect look and say, well, now that would have been like the realpolitik way to go, was as idealistic as the vision that he was presenting. So that's, I think, in a sense of understanding the different politics of that time, which I think he did.
It's an interesting question to ponder, a hard one to answer, partly because I think in order to judge definitively whether Wilson understood or misunderstood human nature, I would have to understand it first myself. And I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. Oh, I'm close, but I don't know if I'm quite there. I think one of the things we tend to forget when we talk about Wilson and international relations is that he was quite an effective domestic politician, both as governor of New Jersey and then as a domestic president. That his presidency was quite transformational. I hinted, alluded in the talk that many of the institutions that today we're questioning were put together in his time, starting with the Federal Reserve only early in his term, and ending with the constitutional amendment that gave women the vote in the federal level. All that happened, and many things in between. All that happened in the domestic arena under his administrations. All sorts of bad stuff happened too, but the point is that he was quite an effective politician. He understood the system. He understood how to get things through Congress. He understood how to work public opinion. John Milton Cooper, who's probably the single biggest Wilson expert alive. He wrote the big biography a few years back. In the end, says that it was his deteriorating health in early 1919 that explains much of his deteriorating function in the peace negotiations themselves, and then especially the latter part of the negotiations when they were doing all that stuff that you were just saying. The first part was the League of Nations covenant, and that actually got through. And then afterwards, when he came back, and of course by September he had the stroke and he was out of commission. And so I think trying to sort of pin Wilson down as a fixed target and say this is how he was and that's it, it doesn't really work, because he changed over time, his views changed over time, and then his health also changed over time, and that we don't like that kind of explanation as historians, because it's not really a morality tale. It's just stuff happens, but it does.
History stuff happens.
Yeah, I think I'm reminded of a comment one of my dissertation advisors made. He said, never presume that human beings are consistent. And for some reason, we have tagged Woodrow Wilson with these kind of universalist things. And I think studying the First World War as long as I have, I think I understand Clemenceau and Lloyd George a lot more than I understand Wilson. He's a hard guy for me to figure out, and I think in part because he's not always consistent. He's a politician. He moves sometimes in the direction that he thinks he needs to move. So I'm not sure I could do anything more other than to say I agree with Jennifer and Erez on that.
Great. We've got time for a few audience questions. If you will state your name and affiliation, and then pose a question and avoid providing a speech. So, sir, here.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Suleiman Wasti, a student of international relations from LSE, Fabian Socialist. My question is to Erez. Point 5 of Wilson had direct antecedents to the Indian National Congress of 1885 and All India Muslim League of 1905. If you see the wording, it's direct quotations from the manifesto. So if you're looking for the genesis and the antecedents of point 5, I mean, because the movements had already taken place. So I just wanted to point it out. Thanks for letting me.
Hi, my name is Alana O'Malley. I'm a Fulbright Scholar at George Washington University and ordinarily a historian at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And thanks very much for a very fascinating discussion. I'm just going to ask a brief question about the self-determination idea. And I could agree, of course, that this statement is very much about laying out a blueprint for American power in the post-war moment. But I'm curious as to why exactly Wilson seeks to institutionalize this international order with the creation of the League. And as part of that effort, he uses the word peoples rather than nations, even though the League is an effort to institutionalize the format of the nation state. So I'm wondering if you could say something about the contradiction inherent in that idea, and whether or not that's also then an inherent criticism of British and French internationalism and modes of European empire.
Thanks for 3 excellent presentations. I'm Paul Sham. I teach Israel Studies at the University of Maryland. I want to address one point that Professor Nyberg brought up, that who would enforce all of these ideas. And I'd say from that, we can understand that the world wasn't as open at that point, because there clearly wasn't any overarching power. And we can see that after World War II, in contrast, when there was at least one power that was ready, willing, and able to change things. So it seems to me that Versailles really couldn't have accomplished the things that their universe of options really wasn't that large.
I guess the way I would respond to that is, I mean, I'm also struck by just how incredibly quick these changes are. So Palestine, just to take the part of the world that you referred to, had been under the Ottoman Empire for what, 1,500 years? I mean, for forever, right? 500, of course. I mean, forever. And there's no British plan in 1914, 1915, or 1916 to change that. And then in the course of 1917, in the course of a few months of 1917, the British decide they will change it, and Allenby marches through the Jaffa Gate. So part of what's happening here, I think, is a shock of how unbelievably fast change is happening. And the change is happening, in fact, faster than the international system can catch up with it. So what Bliss, particularly, and the Americans are looking at in all of this is, okay, if you're going to make Palestine international, what does that actually mean? Who controls it? Who runs it? What do you do with it? And frankly, no one's really thought about what the answers to these questions are. So I think part of the answer to the point that you made would be just how unbelievably rapid change is happening and how fundamental that change is. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone. The Romanovs are gone. These aren't small changes. These are massive tectonic shifts, and something has to fill that gap in. And if I could just pick up on your point, I think it's an incredibly insightful point that he's talking about peoples, not nations, in part because I don't think anybody really has a sense of what reaches the threshold of nation. So Wilson doesn't think the Irish are a nation. They're a people, they're not a nation. Right? So what do you do with them? How do you understand their governance? And are they properly represented through London? I mean, are the Indians properly represented by London if you change the structure? I mean, these are questions, again, nobody's thought of. In 1916, I wrote a book on this. In 1916, nobody in America is thinking about these problems. 2 years later, they're all on the table, and you can reshuffle it any way you think you can. So I think that's part of what's happening here. It's this intellectual confusion of how fast change is coming. And I don't know that we'll do this, but my guess is historians a generation or so from now are going to look at the end of the Cold War in much the same way, that almost anything was on the table.
Well, thank you. Oh, thanks. Thank you for the point in the Indian National Congress. I would be very surprised if Wilson had known about those texts that you mentioned. But yes, the general idea expressed in that point 5 had been current for decades prior, but it had never been expressed in that way, but by a Western leader at that level as a principle for international order. It was certainly claimed by colonial nationalists. It had been claimed for a long time. Yeah, absolutely. To the question about nations and peoples, I think it's so interesting. And Mike wrote the book about it, so I'll just give my own sense, which is, generally speaking, Wilson was a social Darwinist in the sense that he believed that societies evolve. They're not fixed through time. They evolve both at the center in terms of their norms and culture and so forth, and also at the edges in terms of what's in and what's out. So there's an interesting exchange. There's a couple of things I'd like to say, actually. There's an interesting exchange that he has with a British journalist when he just lands. He crosses the Atlantic to go to the Paris Peace Conference, but the Peace Conference doesn't start for a few weeks, so he has this tour of England and Italy and France and all that. And he gives this interview to a British paper, and I don't have the exact quote here, but I'll paraphrase. The journalist asks something that implies that the Brits and the Americans are Anglo-Saxons and that they have this, it doesn't use the word race, but they have this racial affinity that ties them together. And Wilson says, and I found that, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, so bear with me, but he said something along the lines, look, the American nation is no longer an Anglo-Saxon nation. If it was once, it is no longer now. And if we Brits and Americans share something, are connected by something, it's by our ideals, not by our lineage. And he says that even as he is himself exploring there in his touring his own British heritage, but he's also well aware that the American body politic has changed. The other point I want to make, and I wanted to put this in the speech, but in the talk, but I had to take it out just for time. When Wilson goes over on that boat ride, he has a draft of the League of Nations Covenant that he prepared himself on his little typewriter. He was probably the last president who actually wrote his own speeches on his own typewriter. There's no staff. This White House is a bare bones operation at this point in time. And so he has this draft. And one of the articles of the draft, I forget what the number was in the original draft, but it says something like, the League of Nations will guarantee the territorial integrity and the security of the member states, semicolon, but it will also be able by a majority, and again I'm paraphrasing, by a majority of 3/4 to make changes in boundaries and territorial definitions as required, I think he said, by changes in social economic conditions or by changes there are a couple of different criteria that he outlines there for how these changes would be made. And I think he imagined that the League would be this kind of ongoing process of debating and redrawing in an ongoing, without an endpoint necessarily, based on what he saw was the inevitable evolution of peoples. And so the nation would be continuously, the nation as a political entity would be continuously redefined. Now what happens is Robert Lansing sees this and he's flabbergasted, and his other legal advisors, David Hunter Miller and others, see this and they're flabbergasted. The British and the French see this and they're flabbergasted. They get in the negotiations they get rid of the whole thing under after the semicolon, and it becomes the League will guarantee the territorial integrity of the member states, and this becomes Article 10. So this is not a well-known story. I wrote a little piece about this some years ago, but apparently it hasn't percolated. Few people know about this. That the original concept of Article 10, from Wilson's perspective, was the precise opposite of what it ended up doing, which is kind of reifying this borders of a particular moment in time. And we're still struggling with this problem. How do you change borders in a peaceful way? It's a major problem in our structure. And he was thinking about this, but other people saw it as dynamite. That was going to be a very, very dangerous way to run things. Lawyers, right? Exactly.
Okay, we have time for one more set of questions. So. She looks like this row here, 3 in a row. We'll take those 3, and then we'll have one round of answers.
Stanley Kober. I was wondering what this analysis does to the democratic peace theory. The idea has been you get rid of the dictator, and then the people will spontaneously resolve their differences. Doesn't seem to work. The Bliss quote is wonderful about the mosquitoes. What's the alternative? Once you win the war, then what are you supposed to do? Are we stuck with Hobbes's Leviathan?
Take the next 2 questions, and then we'll.
This is a question that deals with money. So, France is a pretty complicated country, and so is Great Britain. Did they somehow see that the reparations from Germany after the war? Did they foresee that how these reparations and how this huge amount of money was to be distributed and handled? Did they ever see that there could be complications in the future, since being a complicated country that France was pre-World War I and also Britain pre-World War I, did they somehow see that this huge amount of money could somehow be used in another manner? I was just curious about that.
All right. Final question?
Quickly, I'm Jimmy Colker, retired Foreign Service officer. The 14 points are often characterized or mischaracterized as presaging a rules-based world order, and even if it didn't happen after World War I, it seems to have been a model which was happening after World War II and the whole last half of the last century, and maybe up to the current administration, that with the U.S., with institutions and processes of which the U.S. was a leading member and a guarantor. And it seems as though the current administration thinks this is out of date, or that this isn't in the U.S. interest to do. And first, was this a myth to begin with? Was there no rule of law that was in the U.S. interest with all these institutional structures? And is it over?
We'll start with Jennifer and then we'll move down.
I think I'll say a few things that I think might tie together for all these questions. I think the first thing was that if you think about money and we think about the reparations payments as being this kind of big transfer of money that's going to occur to help post-war Europe, at least Britain and France, rebuild, I think we should also realize that the flow of money from the United States to Europe continued in the post-war period, and it continued through private philanthropy. So Herbert Hoover, who had led this huge philanthropic mission in 1914 to 1917, over the rape of Belgium, and a lot of American aid was flowing into German-occupied areas, continued with that philanthropic effort all the way into 1923 and redirected most of that aid into Eastern Europe. And it was a lot of that aid was meant to prevent typhus epidemics, famine. The British blockade during the whole Versailles Peace Treaty process was still in effect, so it was just simply a matter of feeding these populations. And so the idea that the United States could also use soft power, that it could use its economic aid and develop trade relationships, that it could begin to connect with portions of the world that it had not traditionally seen a strategic interest in, that this was increasingly in the mindset. And I should just point out that in the pre-war period, while Hoover was directing a lot of aid to Britain and France, there was the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which came into existence, which is very famous for helping survivors of the Holocaust after World War II. But that is a World War I organization that was created to help Jewish refugees who were fleeing on the Eastern Front, which was a huge war of movement. And every time the army moves 200 miles, a bunch of civilians are running in front trying to get out of the way. So there was a huge refugee problem that we haven't really addressed that also had to be handled in the post-war period. And of course, in addition, the hope was that hungry people are more, the thought, just like after World War II was, hungry people are more likely to turn to Bolshevism than people who are well-fed. So I think a lot of this idea that it was just in the hands of the Versailles Peace Treaty and international agreement, laws, set up some international law, and this is going to handle all the world's problems, is a false way to look at a more integrated approach that people were taking in the post-war period. That it was not just, this is the answer and there's nothing else that we can do. And I would really underline what Eris was saying earlier about the intended flexibility of these organizations. The 14 points itself is not a blueprint, and it's not a my way or the highway. There's a lot of vagueness and flexibility in this language, intentionally so. Wilson intended this to be the opening conversation starter. And he knew, and he campaigned on this when he was pushing for the League of Nations. I know there's problems in the Versailles Peace Treaty, absolutely. And you know the best way to fix them? Be part of the League of Nations, and then these things will start being renegotiated. And reparation payments were immediately renegotiated. The bill was immediately lowered. The schedule of payments was immediately changed. When the French occupied the war, after that, there's going to be no more military aspects to that. So in other words, I think that we kind of lose sight of the fact that Americans, diplomats, bankers, philanthropists, were very much part of this post-war world, and so there was a kind of a multifaceted way to approach this problem of restoring Europe, because America needed Europe to be restored. It was still our primary trading partner. Our post-war economy could not thrive without a strong Europe, just like after World War II. That was much longer. Sorry, you're going on that.
So again, I agree with Jennifer. Yes, the League was never intended, and the whole treaty was never intended to be an end state. It was intended to be the setting up of a process, and the notion or the conceit was not that it was the achievement of some sort of perfection, but rather that it was preferable to the system that preceded, or that would be preferable to the system that preceded the war. Wilson's actually very clear about the graduated system that he thought the League should carry out to mitigate conflicts. The first stage it's a three-stage process. The first stage is arbitration. If arbitration doesn't work, then economic sanctions, which would be coordinated through the League. And if that doesn't work, then military power would be used, again coordinated through the League. And actually, we may think that this is utopian, but when we think about it, this is exactly the system that we still use today through the United Nations. We have economic sanctions. There's lots of stuff that happens outside of that, but that's still there. We have the Security Council. We have peacekeeping forces. All of that is intended to be part of the system. And I think that really touches on the question of rules-based. The United States is one of the major centers in the late 19th, early 20th century of the promotion of international law. American lawyers, the American legal profession are in love with international law. They think international law is great and it'll solve everything. And in some sense, Wilson's thinking built on that, but he thinks it's insufficient and too inflexible. And his sense is if you're going to have law, you need to have bodies that both create law and manage, there has to be politics in it. You can't have law without politics. That's his insight from being a constitutional scholar, right? And so the League is intended to be the kind of cognate of the U.S. Congress, the place where the various states can meet and do the politics that will then make the law be effective, and make them buy in a sense, to this regime. So he thinks law is nice, but nowhere near sufficient, and that's why he wants to have these additional institutions.
Just very quickly, because I know we're nearing the end, I would just want to stress the complexity of this time period and the number of possible options, again, that are on the table. In terms of money, yes, absolutely they knew. What they recognized was that any economic structure that you set up, wealth is going to transfer from one party to another party. And whatever you do, someone's going to win in that relationship and someone's going to lose. John Maynard Keynes really wanted, instead of reparations, to lower the amount of debt that everybody owed to everybody. The problem was when you do that, then there are American banks who say, well, we loan money in good faith. We're a private institution. The government can't write away the debts that are owed to us. So reparations become, as Jennifer pointed out, they become a way to try to either encourage good German behavior by lowering them if the Germans are behaving well, or a punishment behavior. So again, they understand what money means and understand it as a tool. There's just no easy way around it. The democratic peace theory question, if you have an answer to that one, I have a job for you at the U.S. Army War College. Certainly, I don't think the French believed in democratic peace theory at all. Clemenceau believed that as Theodore Roosevelt did, Roosevelt was the first commissioner of the New York City Police Department, that this was an occasion of one state, Germany, having committed a crime, and Germany had to be punished. That was the way you did it. You proved to the world that if one state gets out of line, you smack it down. David Lloyd George and the British believed that what had happened is that the system got imbalanced, and what you needed to do is to recreate that balance. Everybody has their own idea about what is going to make this right. I have to confess, in the 8 years I've been teaching at the Army War College, I am more inclined to the balance of power theory than I am to the democratic peace theory. Democratic states can certainly go to war. And third, the international organizations point that you brought up, I'm sympathetic to a French friend of mine who says that the difference isn't that Americans have turned their back on international institutions. The difference is the United States no longer dominates them. That's what has unnerved Americans. So which would reflect on Eris's point about international law. International law is very much the preserve of the people who write and enforce the laws. So this French friend of mine believes that what's changed in the United States is not so much, what has changed is that the United States can no longer enforce its dominance over the international organizations the way it once did. There are states that will challenge the organizations from outside. There are non-state actors that simply ignore those organizations. And there are organizations that the United States used to be able to depend upon to follow those systems, which no longer do it in quite the same way. And that what the recent reaction in the past couple of years has been a response less to the institutions themselves, but America's relationship to them. And I have to say I'm sympathetic to that argument.
Thanks. Well, that'll be the last word. Thank you all for braving the weather and coming here, and please join me in a round of applause for our three great panelists.